All right. Welcome to everyone for this evening. We're excited to have you on the call this evening. We're thankful for your interest. My name is Nancy Sallenberger-Heischman, and I serve as Director of the Office of Ministry for the Church of the Brethren. And so on behalf of the office, I want to express my deep gratitude for each one of the presenters and for Dave Shetler, who will be moderating the conversation tonight. Before we begin, though, I'll just remind you of a couple details. In order to minimize the distraction of lots of beautiful faces for the presentation, we invite you to keep your camera off if you can, in addition to muting yourself. And then when we move into the Q&A, question and answer portion, you're welcome to turn your cameras back on so we can see one another. Feel free to put your questions in the chat box and we'll do our best to sort through them. Don't forget to press enter after you do your question or else it's not going anywhere. Obviously, with this attendance, we may not be able to answer every question, but we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. If you have tech problems, you can look in the chat box and find Carol Strayer. She's our tech assistant tonight. Thank you, Carol. And she's available to help you if you need help. We are recording the conversation so that others can hear it later. So if you have concerns about being included in the recording, just keep your camera off for the whole time if you'd like. If you requested CEUs through your registration, the Brethren Academy will send you a digital certificate soon after the call. And tonight, the conversation will last about an hour and a quarter or so. So just so you can be prepared for that length. We will begin the conversation by inviting the sharing of our three panelists, our presenters, for about 15 minutes or so. And then after that, the time is yours to ask them the questions that you would like or to pose some thoughts for reflection. So feel free to start adding your questions to the chat as soon as you have them right from the start if you'd like to. So I'll turn now to Dave Shetler, who is the District Executive Minister for Southern Ohio, Kentucky District, who will moderate the conversation. And welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Nancy. And yes, welcome to everyone. Glad to have you with us tonight. Just a brief background. When the pandemic began, I started having a weekly Zoom with pastors and other district members and tried to find topics of interest. As the pandemic continued much longer than we anticipated, also turned to other topics. So a little over a month ago, when the shootings happened in Atlanta, I invited Wendy and Lynn to be a part of a Thursday morning conversation. Nancy was a part of that, and she said, can we do that one for the denomination as a whole? And she asked if I would help to moderate that. We also invited Madeline to be a part of this evening's conversation. I knew Madeline had a daytime job, and so I hadn't asked her at that point. So we're glad to have the three of them with us. We're going to begin with some invitations some introductions from them. And I warned them ahead of time we were going to do that by reverse alphabetical order by first name. So Wendy's going to lead that off for us. Wendy?
Thank you, Dave. And can you hear me? Good. All right. First, I want to thank all of you for being here. It really means a lot to me to think that you want to come hear the three of us talk about our identity and what it means to be Asian American in the United States right now. And special thanks to Dave and Nancy for the invitation. It means a lot. So I've been asked to just say a little bit about who I am, and I really treasure the Q&A part. So I'm not going to assume that I know what your questions are, but I'll tell you a little bit about who I am. Many of you already know that I serve the denomination on the staff as publisher of Brethren Press and Communications, and I joined the Brethren in 1982, having grown up Presbyterian. But I was adopted when I was about 1, internationally, from Korea, into a white family in California. And for me, I can't really separate race and adoption. They are totally intertwined. I was never not aware that I was Asian, but as an Asian adoptee in a white world, I could sometimes be startled when I saw myself in a mirror. Nowadays, I am always aware of my identity, and I've heard it said sometimes that one of the differences between people who are white and people who are not white is that people who are not white always think about their race. I remember as a child singing the song Jesus Loves Me, and after a while I came to not really like that song because of the words red and yellow, black and white, which were not terms that we used in regular conversation. So it didn't make sense to me that we would sing them in Sunday school. A long time ago, maybe one of the first times I ever filled out a form that had a demographic section. The sections were white, black, Hispanic, and other. And I've never forgotten that. And I think it's a symbol of what it feels like to be Asian in America. And I don't think it's just me, because I've read many, many articles and books that say the same thing. In a sense, I have felt like I'm in between. I'm not culturally Korean, but I'm not white. And if you think about that, if you're not either one, then it sometimes feels like I'm not anything. If people say, I don't think of you as ethnic, I have to be something. At least I hope I am. Most of my life, I'm the only Asian in the room. And that was true when I was a child, and it's true when I go to meetings. It's true in much of what I do. And when I'm in a new space, I am very aware of my appearance. And that's where I really know that I'm not white. So if I walk into a restaurant and everybody's heads turn, I know why they're looking at me. When older men walk up to me and try to speak Korean, I 100% know that they served in the Korean War and they want to say hello to me in Korean. And sometimes they're annoyed if I don't respond with pleasure at being able to talk to somebody who served in my country. One time I was on a plane and I was sitting with, just happened to be sitting in the same row as the only other Asians on the plane. And when the couple next to me said no thanks to the drinks, the flight attendant just passed right over me as if I belonged with them and wouldn't want to drink either. When I walk into a small store, I will speak up right away to the shopkeeper so that that person knows that I know how to speak English. So the impact of Atlanta was the first time that I remember Asians being front and center in the news, and it was a bit startling. I felt a little bit like it was being in this in-between space, this in the shadows, invisible, and suddenly having a spotlight. I wasn't used to seeing Asians being on the cover of Time magazine or in the New York Times. And so I've had to do a lot of thinking and a lot of reading. I had quite a few thoughts about that time, and I'm still processing them. I would say my time, that it's been a journey all along in my whole life of learning who I am. I think that might be true of anybody who emigrates to another country. In this case, it's certainly true for me. But the Atlanta shootings and the anti-Asian hate crimes that have been happening this past year take it to a level of more introspection and more thinking, which has been a good reason for me to learn even more. And I have to say, I've learned more about Asian American history in the last couple months because I've had the opportunity to. So anyway, I thank you so much for your questions. I look forward to them. I hope this is a space where you feel comfortable asking the three of us whatever you'd like to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Good introduction to who you are. Appreciate that. Madeline, we'll call on you next.
Thank you, Dave. And I want to echo Wendy's thanks to both you and Nancy for inviting us to be part of this today. And while we are focused on Asian American and Pacific Islander issues right now, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that today is National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and to remember the Indigenous people who have been lost to murder and those who remain missing. And also, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining this webinar from the traditional land of the Potawatomi and the Miami peoples. So for those of you who don't know me, although I recognize many of the names on tonight's webinar, my name is Madalyn Metzger, and I serve as the Vice President of Marketing at Everence Financial, which used to be known as MMA, or Mennonite Mutual Aid. So these days, I frequently get mistaken as a Mennonite, but I actually grew up in the Church of the Brethren and have been very active in the denomination, both locally and nationally. I grew up in the Midwest. I was part of the Illinois-Wisconsin district for my childhood. In fact, I was a member at the Springfield First Church of the Brethren in Illinois, and I now attend the Goshen City Church of the Brethren here in Goshen, Indiana. Some of you, if you aren't aware of my background, may be wondering why I have been asked to be on a panel of Asian American speakers. I identify as Amerasian, meaning that my father is an American national, and my mother is from Vietnam. They met when my dad was in Brethren Volunteer Service in Vietnam, and I actually think they are on this webinar tonight, so hi, Mom and Dad. The common vernacular is to refer to myself as biracial, and that is accurate, but more and more I am becoming a bit uncomfortable with that term because it also insinuates halfness. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but I don't feel like I'm half of anything. I feel like I'm fully white and fully Asian American at the same time, which has its own interesting dynamics. I grew up in a middle-class family, a middle-class region. I did attend public school growing up. The school that I went to up until the 3rd grade was racially diverse, and I had a number of friends who were of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. After that, though, we moved to a community where it was a predominantly white school system all through high school. And then I went on to Manchester College at the time, now university, where I was a 3rd generation of my family to graduate from there. And for those of you who are familiar with Manchester, you know that it is also a predominantly white university, although I did gain more exposure to Black peers there than I had in high school. In fact, my husband, who I met in college, is Black. I would say that I've always been aware of my heritage. I grew up eating with forks, knives, and spoons, and also with chopsticks. I always felt proud of my heritage, both as a member of the Church of the Brethren, my Anabaptist heritage, and my Vietnamese heritage. But I grew up in an era where many immigrant parents wanted their children to assimilate into American society. So I did not retain my early Vietnamese language skills. I can still understand enough using context clues that I communicate primarily with my mom, but I will respond to her in English. My Metzger family in particular supported my growth and my self-identity, and I always felt included and accepted by them. And in fact, I don't really recall anyone blatantly or abusively treating me as inferior, but rather what I do remember are what has been coined since then as microaggressions. I can recall instances where I've been described as exotic. I also can recall instances where I have been described as white enough by whites. On occasion, I was treated as a novelty, like a toy that could be played with and discarded by some of my more distant Vietnamese cousins. I am frequently asked, "What are you?" for those who don't just assume that I am white. And I've witnessed and felt the anger and pain when others have treated my mom or my other relatives a certain way because of the way that she looks or her accent or her country of origin. So to some extent, I've always struggled internally about what it is to be me. I recognize that I present to most as part of the dominant white culture, which affords me white privilege. Yet I don't want to discount my Vietnamese heritage, nor could I if I wanted to. I know that I see the world differently and process experiences differently because of that heritage. And that sometimes creates a challenging dichotomy of interpreting myself and the world through two different sets of lenses, both Western and Eastern. My earliest memory of being aware of my racial identity was actually not one that I think a lot of people would expect. I was in early elementary school and had been invited to a birthday party for a good friend of mine. And she had invited a lot of her other friends from her church, not just from our school. So I didn't know all of the girls at that party. And it was decided that we were all going to play with Barbies. And she came up to me and said, Madeline, I'm going to give you the white Barbie because you're white. And that's when I realized that all the other girls at the birthday party were Black. And so I think that is my earliest memory of realizing that I was different, but also realizing that the interpretation of how I was different was actually not fully accurate. At Church of the Brethren events, I always was somewhat aware that I was different somehow, even though it was a denomination. It is a denomination that I grew up in and was deeply steeped in. For a long time, I thought maybe it was just because I was so tall. For those of you who don't know me, I'm 5'10", and so I tend to stick out in crowds. But in hindsight, I think there was more to it. And even now, I find myself scanning rooms, like Wendy said, to see if there are any other Asian Americans there. And I have actually had some really humorous and awkward interactions when I've become excited to see other Asian Americans. And then I introduce myself and they are confused at first because they don't necessarily see the external features that they would expect to see in an Asian American. Admittedly, while I'm so honored to be part of this discussion tonight with Wendy and Lynn, admittedly and maybe a bit surprisingly to me, I've been struggling a bit leading up to tonight with some feelings of trepidation and inferiority. I've given many talks and workshops on anti-racism, and I'm very comfortable with helping others on their journeys of dismantling systems of oppression. But I am not often asked to talk about my own experiences with racism. And it's further bringing to light to me just when I think I've figured out what it means to be me, I uncover more self-awareness of and at times more struggle with the internalized racialization that I've carried inside myself and about myself for years. And if internalized racialization is a new term for you, in a nutshell, it's often used to refer to how people of color or people of a non-dominant ethnic background are raised in a society where racism has been and still is so prevalent that it causes internalized elements of racist thinking related to things like beliefs and stereotypes and assumptions and judgments, not just about others, but about themselves, and how messages then influence our understanding of mixed race identity and how we racially identify ourselves. So this impacts things and experiences emerging in contexts like racial categorization, normativity, attractiveness, belonging, etc. So, like I said, while I view myself fully white and fully Asian American, at the same time, I struggle with claiming that in front of many Asian Americans because I'm not sure if they think I'm trying to appropriate the term. On the flip side of that, being told that I'm white enough not only erases my Vietnamese heritage and culture, but it sets the assumption that being white is the preference and the norm. So I bring all of that to this conversation and to circle it back around, Dave, to the impact of the Atlanta shootings and really the anti-Asian xenophobic attacks that have been happening increasingly frequently during the pandemic. It's hit me hard because it has forced me to further process how I can walk around and pass pass as white, but yet also worry about people like my mom running out to get groceries and whether or not something will happen to her. So that's a lot of what I'm bringing to the table tonight.
Madeline, thank you. And you raised some good topics for us to ponder. Lynn, we're ready to hear from you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to everyone. I want to echo the same sentiments as Wendy and Madeline. Thank you to everyone in our audience, familiar faces, new friends as well, and to Dave and Nancy who've offered to host this. My name is Lin Reish, and I'm a Chinese American adoptee. I currently live in Charlotte, North Carolina, but I grew up in the Richmond Church of the Brethren in Richmond, Indiana. And growing up in Richmond, I didn't really see a lot of people that looked like me at my church, in my congregation, or in my community at large. And so my experiences as an Asian American have largely been shaped by my proximity or lack of it to whiteness. And I think in the United States, conversations about identity are largely centered around concepts of race and nationality, which have been really unique for me to navigate as an Asian American who's also an adoptee. And so as an Asian, I have felt sometimes like I've really fallen into the in-between space of the Black and white dichotomy that really forms the racial narrative in America. And as an immigrant adoptee who was brought here at 2 and has no memory of the motherland, I am regarded by people as an immigrant, by those who couldn't tell from looking at me that this is the only country that I've really ever known. And I don't think I ever really truly realized how alien I felt until I studied abroad in Harbin, China. I studied Mandarin in my last 2 years of high school and then in university at Vanderbilt, and had the opportunity to spend a couple of months in Harbin. And it was like the script totally flipped. All of a sudden, my white friends were the ones that were getting asked, "Where are you from? You're so exotic. Tell me more about your heritage." And it was the first time in my daily life that I didn't feel actively othered. Like I could go to the grocery store and no one would look at me. And I could walk up to the cashier and people would just assume that I was Chinese. And no one ever gave me a second glance. And I don't think that I'd ever realized until I had that experience that what I was experiencing at home in America was very different. And yet I have still never felt more relieved than when I returned from study abroad, set my 2 feet on the soil at the Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson Airport and inhaled a McDonald's burger. So I think that navigating those two spaces has always been part of my identity. And I think similar to how Madeline was mentioning those feelings, I do struggle with those feelings of being an imposter, being not American enough for my white family or my white friends in my community, and not being Asian enough for the people who I met in college or the people who made up my Asian American Student Association at school. And so that's sort of the lens that I'm coming to you guys tonight from, but I'm excited to be here and to join in conversation with everyone gathered here.
Thank you, Lynn. And I just want to express at the beginning here appreciation to the 3 of you for coming on and being vulnerable and sharing your lives and your experiences with us. So thank you so much for coming. What questions do you have? We're ready for questions to come. And I know the 3 of them are excited to hear what you would like to know, what you'd like to hear. Nancy, do we have one to start with?
We have a few questions, but I'd encourage people to put questions in the chat. There's so much to reflect on from this sharing that's been so rich so far. So I encourage that. Just a practical question at the beginning was, how many Asian American members are there in the United States Church of the Brethren? So if there's any one of the 3 of you that'd like to comment on that. I know Wendy's been doing a little bit of statistical study, but maybe the rest of you would have some comments too. So any thoughts on that?
We don't know because those statistics are not captured. The Church of the Brethren doesn't maintain racial statistics, even though there has been a desire to do that, but it would be really hard. In fact, when I've thought about how one would do that, even in my own congregation, I'm not sure there's any single person there who would be able to accurately identify everybody. Like, how do you count my children who are biracial? And how about people that you just don't know? Do you ask everybody? So the one answer is that we don't know. But the other answer is not very many. And I remember one year at an annual conference wondering, I thought, well, I'm just going to count up how many people I've seen here who are Asian. And thankfully, it was a few more than I thought. I thought it was going to be 3 or 4. And it was, I needed both hands to count them, but it's really not very many. I'm sure there are lots that I don't know, but of the ones who are known in the denomination, it's really very, very few.
Anything that the other two would like to add to that? Or
I've not tried to actively count while I've been at things like annual conference, but I have participated in other intercultural ministries programs through the denomination, and I can say that it's very, very rare to see any Asian Americans or Pacific Islanders in that group. It's primarily, I've found it to be primarily African American and Hispanic or Latino participants in that group. And usually when I see Wendy's kids, we get really excited because it's like the biracial kids group.
I think similarly, growing up, we were always close with Wendy and her family, and they were the people that I saw at conference or when they came to town for seminary stuff that I would see that were also Asian. But outside of that, haven't really seen many other members of the API community.
All right, Nancy, I see some more questions coming through. So do
Yes.
you have one ready for us?
Yes, one of the earlier questions was, as an adoptive parent of a beautiful brown boy, how can I better prepare him for things that I have not experienced as a white man? Anybody want to take that one on?
Well, I'll start. I hope the others will join in. One thing is to recognize what you don't know. And so maybe it would be introducing him to people who do know that experience. So making sure that there are people in his life who are similar to him. Another thing I would say is don't assume that he will tell you everything. So my parents never knew how I was treated at school. I think when I look back on that, I was protecting them. I also didn't think they could do anything about it. And I didn't think they would really understand. I think it would have been typical for them to say, oh, you shouldn't feel that way. And the reality is you do. So I think just providing some other opportunities for him to know people is good. But another one is to also think about your own feelings and to recognize, to think through, why did I adopt? What does that mean? What is my own view of adoption and race? So that you can be pretty authentic with those feelings, because we all have them. And it would be good to not sweep those under the carpet.
Lynn or Madeline, anything you want to add?
As an adoptee, I think that I didn't really realize that I wasn't the same race as my parents, or that I was a different race than any of my community members until I reached the age where I was in elementary school and, kindergarten, first grade, which is, I think, when the concept of race first enters a child's mind, and then children don't have the filter to address some of the nuances in discussing what race looks like, what modern families look like, and why different families might look different. I think, speaking to Wendy's points about the fact that your child won't share everything, or that they need to be introduced to community members who may have experiences that are more similar to theirs, is really important. I was fortunate enough that in Richmond, there was a small group of other Chinese American adoptees, and that I grew up in a time where adoption wasn't as stigmatized as it once was in the past, and that adoption, particularly of Chinese children in the late 90s and early 2000s, was fairly common. And so I didn't face stigma necessarily for being adopted, but I found great comfort in the community that I had of Asian American adoptees. As a child, it was interesting just to see families that looked like mine, and then growing up to hear other kids' experiences and to sort of bond over what it meant to be really divorced from our cultural backgrounds. Because I grew up in Indiana and my parents didn't speak Mandarin. And so there were certain parts of my upbringing that were really disconnected from how I look, from my ethnic, I think, background. And so really recognizing that and making space for your child to have those conversations with you and also with people who might understand it from a more empathetic standpoint is really important.
Thank you. Madeline, anything else you want to add?
I can't really add too much about the adoptive child experience, but I will echo what Wendy and Lynn have said about the importance of having a community around your family that can empathize and be there for your child who may have questions. And I know that it might seem difficult or emotionally challenging to see your child go to someone else with certain questions, but as the important part is that he or she have that space, that safe community and family to support.
Good, thank you. Nancy, what's the next one?
Well, someone asks, Mary Hagan asked, are there generational differences in the experiences?
So without divulging your ages, I know that we have 3 different age groups here.
So I identify as being part of Generation X, although I am on the young end of Gen X. I mentioned in my opening comments that it was pretty commonplace, I think, when I was growing up for immigrant parents to want their children to assimilate. I've talked to other children of immigrants who have had similar experiences who are around my age. I think that's different now. I think, at least in the immigrant experience, I think that's different now. I think families not only want their children to be able to communicate in both English and their native language, but especially in certain pockets and certain groups, the parents or the grandparents often rely on the children to help translate for them. So that's something, at least generationally, that I've noticed is different.
Wendy or Lynn?
Since I am not the child of immigrants, I don't have that experience, and I've read about it. I think many immigrant parents who came were struggling simply to make it and didn't expect it to be easy. And what I've learned is that younger people of Asian American identity are more activist, less willing to be quiet. And so you hear about elderly Asian Americans being attacked, but not wanting to say anything about it. But sometimes it's their children or grandchildren or younger people in the community who make a fuss about it and make sure that that information is being known. So I think there are some generational differences. I don't have them because because my parents were white. So most of it is what I have read and learned about the Asian American experience.
I was born in either the tail end of the millennial generation or the very beginning of the Gen Z generation. And I think that one of the biggest things that I've noticed amongst myself and my non-white friends is the way that they have embraced their heritage, the way that has entered sort of the cultural, I guess, environment as being cool. And so it's cool to speak a different language. It's cool to eat poke. It's cool to have sushi. Like, it's cool to have your mom make udon noodles, or it's, and so I think that for those of us who are sort of older, and I grew up watching my 2 best friends in elementary school were Japanese, and they would bring bento boxes to school lunch, and people would make faces. They would talk about how it smelled. They would be like, ew. They would ask me, are you eating dog? Are you eating cat? Have you ever tried that? And then now bento boxes are huge teach for kids in elementary school, and there's a poke place popping up everywhere. And so I think for us, we're wrestling, I think, with the transition from being othered in a way that's not cool to be singled out as unique and exotic. And I don't think that I don't think that the fetishization is a better approach, but I think that that's definitely something that I've noticed just in the general culture, because like Wendy, I can't speak to the identity differences between the older generation of Asian American immigrants. But I think that's something that my friends have talked about to me and that I've noticed just generally in the popular culture, is that transition from otherism to sort of exoticism or fetishization. And I'm not sure that it's better, but it's definitely something that we have been discussing and has.
Appreciate your insights. Nancy, what's our next question?
There are two questions that relate to persons' experiences within congregations. So I'm going to read both of them and see what you'd like to comment on. Dana Cassell says, have you all encountered particular practices of primarily white congregations that felt either especially welcoming and respectful of you and the fullness of who you are, or particularly hurtful? And then Donna asks, what can our Church of the Brethren congregations do to support Asians in our communities? So those kind of go together in a sense. What's been your experience and what should congregations be trying to do?
I've not experienced walking into a congregation, a Church of the Brethren congregation, and feeling out of place. But again, I recognize that may be because I present as part of the dominant culture, or at least I present as racially ambiguous. and I've probably noticed it more in relation to like my husband. I mean, he cannot hide the fact that he is Black. So I mean, I guess fortunately for me, I've always felt welcomed inside of a Church of the Brethren congregation. As far as what congregations can do, I think this type of forum is a great starting point to listen and learn and ask questions and dig deeper and start to hear stories and experiences that are not like your own, and building your own awareness about that, and then vocalizing it and becoming allies, I think is an important step.
Wendy or Lynn, anything to add? Wendy, you're unmuting. Go ahead.
That's such a thick question. I think I could, if I just sat and thought, I would keep coming up with more thoughts. But first of all, I've never had a terribly negative experience. I think the experiences that I've had within the church setting that are negative would be what you would call microaggressions. And sometimes you don't really think until later that they bothered you. So things like, well, a long time ago, an assumption that after somebody saw my picture that I spoke with an accent, had never met me or heard me, but just assumed from my appearance that I was that person who spoke with an accent. I remember being caught in a long conversation in a parking lot by a well-meaning person who just assumed that I would want to know all about the refugees that were being resettled, that I would feel deeply connected. And I probably should have, but I felt like I wasn't any more connected than other well-intentioned church members, but it was because of my race. But on the other side, it's the assumption that I'm not who I am. So I think that making assumptions that I am not something, I've actually had people implicitly say I'm not, I don't count. And so maybe the answer is to get to know people, and when you know somebody, to learn their story. One time I was making a little presentation to a group of parents that were getting ready to adopt internationally. It was through a religious social service agency. And one of them asked the question, we got to talking about the awkward questions that people like us get asked in public. And one woman said, but I'm honestly interested. I would like to know, is there ever a time when it's okay to ask somebody where they're from? And I paused for a long time and I tried to think of all the options and finally said, no, it's not okay. You can't just walk up to somebody who's a stranger and say, where are you from? And I've had that happen. One of the clearest times was a man on a bus at Niagara Falls in front of my family. And he started talking to me across the aisle. And I thought, this is really rude that he is making me talk loud across an aisle about who I am. So there's that line between asking questions just because you're curious, but you don't know the person well enough. And the other side, which is knowing somebody and wanting to know more about them. I've had plenty of friends who will ask me, they'll say, I hope this question doesn't seem inappropriate, and let me know if it does. And when it's a friend, I always say, that is very appropriate. You can ask me any question because you're my friend. And that's different than being accosted in public by somebody who doesn't know me. So I guess the answer I would give is get to know the people in your congregation and ask them their stories. I have to say, this feels a bit like a privilege here to think that there are people who want to know who we are.
Thanks for that insight, Wendy. Lynn, anything you want to add?
I think similar. I've always felt really welcome in the Church of the Brethren. I think probably because I have been insulated by my parents' whiteness, and I have their last name Reish. And so whenever I walked into a COB, someone knows, oh, is your dad Todd? Does your mom work at the seminary? And so I have never felt unwelcome in a church congregation. But I think that Wendy was speaking about some of the microaggressions that we might encounter. I think the other end of the spectrum might be that colorblind approach that I think people that are really well-intentioned say, well, you know, I'm scared to talk about race. I'm scared to talk about identity. And so I'm going to pretend that race doesn't exist, that your identity in this room is the same as everyone else's identity. And I think that erasure, as well-intentioned as it is really harmful to the openness of the conversations that Wendy is talking about. That in order to really learn someone's story and to understand someone's story, you have to accept who they are as they present themselves to you. And so that doesn't mean ignoring that someone might have different lived experiences than you. That doesn't mean ignoring that there may be past racial trauma or generational trauma that follows them and affects the way that they experience the world. And so I think that that's one of the other things that I would really keep in mind, that I think that I encounter from a lot of people who think that my ability to speak English really well and that my assimilation into American culture precludes me from being someone that is not a white American. And so I think that keeping that in mind, that really to accept people as they are requires seeing all that they are.
Let me add one more thing that I thought of while Lynn was talking. I've been in settings, well, most of the settings I'm in, I am the only person of color, I'll say that. That's changing a little bit, but that is true much of the time. But I've been in meetings where I'm the only person of color and I make a comment, a suggestion about something that's related to race, and it's dismissed. And I think, well, maybe I should get a little more vote than the rest of the people in the room. I remember once making a suggestion about children pictured in an ad campaign that I was working on. And I said, well, how about if we move away from these token representations, so there's everybody looks like your stereotypical fill in the blank. And I said, maybe we could have some children in these pictures that are a little more racially ambiguous. And a man said, it's too bad that we're at that place. And I thought, wait a minute. I was the one who said it. I actually think that would be a good idea. America is looking racially ambiguous. My children do. And this is what America's becoming. So maybe the people in our pictures can look that way. So I just thought he wasn't listening. And I think that's unintentional, totally unintentional, but that happens a lot.
again, I just want to thank the three of you for sharing the story. It's good to hear your stories and know that you are among friends as we gather here tonight. Nancy, what's our next one?
Well, I just can't resist asking Wendy, does that mean that there's a term called race-splaining that would be similar to mansplaining? And I've never heard that term, but you almost sound like you're defining it. So
Oh, I
couldn't resist.
I'd not used that term, but yes, it exists.
It does. Okay. Didn't think I invented it. One of the other questions was from someone who wanted to say that thank you so much for sharing with us. And the question was, particularly after the Atlanta shootings, I heard requests for people to check in with Asian American friends. Did you have people check in with you at that time? And was that helpful or not?
I did have people check in with me. I've never had that happen any other time. And every single one of them was beautiful. They were people who were kind and did not make assumptions and just said beautiful words. I appreciated every single one of them.
I also had people who reached out to me, which was a very heartwarming and very different experience for me. I don't know if I've ever had anyone reach out to check on me as an Asian American.
I also had people reach out to me, and I think going back to the conversation Wendy had brought up about how when someone asks how you are, who you are, what you are, that has a whole different meaning when it's someone who is close to you, who is a friend, who, you know, genuinely cares about you, and it isn't asking from a place of sort of distance or otherism. And I think that I had several people reach out that were really, really close to me, and it meant a lot to me. And they didn't have to reach out because I knew that they cared and I knew that they saw me for who I was. And then I had several people that were slightly more distant from me that I hadn't talked to a while. And I think I struggled with some of those messages because it felt like if you didn't care about me and my personal life outside of this traumatic incident that affected people that looked like me or affected people that might have been members of my community, I didn't really know how to feel about some of those messages from people that didn't necessarily indicate that they cared about me outside of this moment of trauma. And so I think that it came from a place of kind-heartedness and genuine concern. And so part of me was like, well, it's so nice that, you know, they thought of me. And then the other part of me was like, am I just the only Asian person that they knew? And they felt obligated to, you know, send a text so that they could feel like a good person. And so I think from my perspective, like Wendy was talking about earlier, I think that it means so much when it comes from people who you are close to, who you know care about you. But for me, I did struggle with those messages from people who were more distant.
Well, we are glad to be in relationship with the three of you tonight. So thank you. Nancy, do you have another one?
Yes, Terry Lynn asks, with the difference in Asian cultures, how do you feel about the inclusion of all Asians in the same, quote, basket, unquote? Historically, Korean, Chinese, and Vietnamese are very different in cultures and in the so-called American story. Another question that I think would be a good follow-up to that is, what would you want us to know about the history of Asian Americans? And do you have any suggested resources? So if you could comment on kind of lumping everybody into the same basket, and then what resources would be helpful for people who want to learn more? Yeah.
That's a big one, but let's hear what you have to say.
Yeah, looks like Madeline wants to jump in, or any one of you.
I can start. That is a big question, and I don't know if I have my response, you know, fully formulated, but it is problematic, I think, to lump all Asian cultures together because they are very different. In some ways, they can also have similarities, but they are very different. Just as I think it's problematic to lump all African cultures together and all Central and South American cultures together. I think that's something that we as a North American society need to do better at recognizing the rich cultural differences that each for lack of a better term, subgroup within the group brings. On the other hand, there are times that I think there's power in having groups come together in solidarity. I think you see that not only in the Asian American communities, but in social justice, racial justice issues in general, when other racial ethnic groups come together. This country has a very long history of trying to separate different racial and ethnic groups from each other in order to maintain white supremacy and power. So it's kind of a mixed bag. It's on the one hand, I really want to acknowledge and celebrate the cultural differences that people bring. On the other hand, though, I don't want that to be to the detriment of everyone coming together to recognize the oppression and injustice that we all continue to face, even though our experiences with that oppression and injustice have been different, if that makes sense. I might have a clarification later.
This is actually an issue that I have struggled with. What issue? May Messenger from the Publisher column is about being Asian and American, and I started to write it after Atlanta, and it took me a couple weeks. It was harder to write than I expected. Seems like you can either write a little, like a tweet length thing, or a major article, but something 400 words was hard for me to say. And one of the things that I struggled with is being in this basket, because I didn't grow up with a basket that looked like that. The common question I got when I was an elementary school kid was, are you Japanese or Chinese? And I would sort of proudly say, I'm not either one, I'm Korean. I mean, it didn't really matter what I was. I just knew that that they were simplistic. So I thought of myself as, I didn't have the words for it then, but Eastern Asian, from one of those three countries. I did not think of myself as in the same basket as people from the Pacific Islands or India or Southeast Asia. I had some kinship, but I did not identify that way. And so as recently as when Kamala Harris became the vice president, and there were all these headlines saying it's the first Black woman and the first Asian woman, I thought, Asian? Because I didn't think of her as being like me. And so, and I think one of the realities I've learned over the time is this issue of identity is never fixed in place. I am constantly learning something new. So that's one of the things I've learned is, oh, I'm Asian American, and there are a whole lot of other Asian Americans in the category. But there's so much diversity, not just in ethnic and cultural background, but in how you came to the United States. Unfortunately, a lot of it is not good reasons, but also class. When I think about the women who were shot in Atlanta, my first thought after finding out they were Asian was, this is about poor immigrant women. Many of them were older. They're not who you might have expected to be. I mean, they didn't fit the stereotype of massage shop. So there was a lot going on in that we call it intersection sometimes. There's a lot, it's not a single answer. But I think one of the things I learned, I've been doing a lot of reading, and I learned where the term Asian American came from. I didn't know it. It was a rallying cry in 1968 when the Asian American community learned from the Black community about civil rights and that they would need to fight for their rights. And it became a political movement. It has since segued into something much broader than politics. It's not the same thing, but I didn't know that the term was coined in I think it's 68, but it's around that time in the Berkeley area, Berkeley, California. So I was glad to learn that bit of history because I thought it was just a term that was assigned to us from the Census Bureau. When I grew up, when I was little, Asian American was not the term that was used. I was kind of happy to get Asian American instead of Oriental. But I'm glad to know that history and I want to know more about it. I'm learning something every day about my own identity.
I think Wendy and Madeline have spoken really well about sort of the nuances of being lumped together and what being Asian and Asian American really means. Just wanted to tag in on the point about learning about history. I was never really taught about my history or my community's history in my classes. Lucky to learn about, the Holocaust and slavery, I think. But I think that for me, part of my continued education about what it means to be Asian is learning about what Asianness means in America outside of, the textbook history, which I think tends to be traumatic because it talks about things like the Chinese Exclusion Act and lynching and Japanese internment camps and, the Vietnamese and Korean wars. And so for me, it's been about, seeking out Asian artists and reading novels from Asian writers, even if they're not about, being Asian. If they're just from a writer who happens to be Asian, and following Asian influencers on social media. I spend way too much of my time on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And so I might as well be diversifying my feed and really incorporating those voices. And watching movies that feature Asian actors and actresses, again, even if it's not, a historical melodrama, if it's, a rom-com or, a fantasy, just making sure that the ways that we interact with Asians and Asian Americans today isn't just through that lens of, well, I learned in the textbook about all of these traumatic experiences in the community. That's been something that's been really helpful for me and is something that I've been actively trying to incorporate.
Good, thank you. Well, we're getting lots of good questions, Nancy. We have about 10, 15 more minutes. So what's the next one?
The next one offered is, how different or similar are the words race, ethnic, and ethnicity? I don't know if that's an easy one to answer or not, but kind of looking at the distinctions between the terminology. So anyone want to respond to that one?
I can take a stab at that. Well, as I said, I can take a stab at it. According to the U.S. government and the criteria that they use for things like the census, race would be basically anything pertaining to, basically anything that's not Latino or Hispanic. And yet Latino and Hispanic is considered an ethnicity. So I think if you were to interpret that into the Asian American Pacific Islander context, the three panelists here, we would be considered Asian American in race, but our ethnicity might be like the nationality or the national culture that we come from. If that makes sense. It gets confusing though, because Latino and Hispanic heritage is separated out as an ethnicity and not a race. But I think it's also important to recognize that race is a social construct. It is something that was developed in order to categorize people, not because there actually was any biological difference. And now, made up biological differences were used to justify some of the racialization and racial categorization that has happened over generations. But that's part of why I think it is so hard to define and to differentiate between the two, because they are completely socially made up constructs.
This isn't to provide an answer. I think Madeline did a better job of defining the nuances of those terms. But I remember Googling, like, what is ethnicity? Because I knew that racially I was Chinese, I was Asian. But I was looking at ethnicity, it talks about, and I think the Google definition is like your cultural group or the social group to which you belong. And as an Asian American who was an adoptee, I was like, well, then is my ethnicity white? Because I grew up in white America and I grew up in a white family and the culture that I belong to is white. And so that was just my experience in sort of grappling with those terms growing up and thinking about, but nobody thinks of me as white. Can I even be Asian and white? Does Asian American cover that term? And so, it's good of Madeline to point out that these are social constructs, but they're social constructs that I have definitely grappled with and that have very real consequences, I think, for our identities or lack of identity.
I'm not a sociologist and I have no great definitions of those, and I find them confusing, actually. But if you look at the history of whiteness in the United States, you can see why it's confusing, because each new group was regarded as not white until the next group came in and the power structure agreed that like Italians could be white and whatever the group. Look up the origin of the word Caucasian. After I learned that, I decided I wasn't going to use it anymore. It was creative. Well, it comes from the Caucasus Mountains, which nobody here came from. Anyway, those things become embedded in our they're just the way things are. And so I think it's helpful to learn why things became the way they are, because a lot of times there's not a good reason. I was taught when I was a child that there are 3 races: Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid. And I knew which one, I was told which one I was in. Nobody uses those terms now, but things change. And I don't know, it's the more I read, the more those terms become unhelpful.
Thank you all. Nancy, we have time for a few more, I think.
Sure. Travis asks, do you have any thoughts on the term Brethren heritage as an Asian American? What does it mean to you to hear the term Brethren heritage?
To me, it primarily conjures up history and values and theological frameworks related to our Anabaptist and Pietist roots. And I recognize I'm probably in a unique position to view it that way because of also my role with Everence and the Mennonites. But yeah, from a cultural standpoint, the Brethren, we come from a very rich heritage and background. I do celebrate that. It can also be used as a tool of exclusion, whether that's conscious or unconscious, as more individuals kind of discover the Anabaptist faith beliefs and values, but they may not come from, the typical European Anabaptist stream. I think that sometimes playing the Brethren name game or talking about our history as if it's only about the Brethren who originated in Germany and that part of Europe can be exclusionary.
Anyone else want to
Well, I
comment?
love Brethren identity and Brethren history, and a big part of what I do in publishing in the Church of the Brethren is to help people embrace that and learn more about it and become familiar with it. I'm really aware that up until a certain point, it was all white. I also know that some of the parts that weren't white were not shining moments. So in Ohio, when early Black clergy were sort of pushed out and said, go back home, you can preach to your own kind. And I think as part of our Brethren history, we need to tell those stories. We just redid the Forerunners card game, and we carefully went through all the names and added a couple more, but replaced a few. And we made sure that there were some people who were not white. And we also chose on one of them to say a negative thing. There's the card game is like authors, where you get a set. And there's 4 things that are said about each person. And on one of them, forget, Samuel Weir, I think it was, we said that he was told to leave, because I think people need to know that. So one would hope that the Brethren identity could grow. What I find that Brethren tend to do is forget that the word we should be inclusive. As an editor, I think we is one of the slipperiest words around. That's the thing I look for first when I'm editing something, is the word we, because sometimes in one sentence it has 3 different meanings, like we, the citizens of the United States, we Christians, and we brethren. And so I try to edit so that it's always clear who we is. But the easy thing is to say, we welcome all people, or we do this. But if you look at it just a little bit closely, the we is we white brethren welcome people who don't look like us. So it's those subtle things that I think it's easy to not hear when you're the one speaking them, but I hear them. And I think people who are considering whether to come in hear them. So it might be as simple as, oh, you're not from around here, are you? Which sounds friendly, but it basically is saying, I don't recognize you. You're not one of us, are you? And you can say welcome, but you've already said you're not one of us. So I think there's a lot of care that needs to be taken to how how white brethren talk and think about who the church is and what it means to be brethren.
Anyone else? If not, I've got one more question.
Yep. Go ahead, Nancy.
Okay. Tina Raymond asks, I'm curious if the 3 of you have any especially good book recommendations. Anything that has helped you learn more about your own heritage, about racism in general. I see Wendy going for a stack, or any fiction authors of Asian American heritage you recommend, or movies. So yeah, and if you want to throw it in the chat, you're welcome to, or we'll have this recording later. But yeah, tell us, what should we be reading and looking at and listening to?
I'm pulling up my list, so if someone else wants to speak first.
Well, I did look at my bookshelf, and I brought in like 6 or 8 here. Many of my books about Asians or by Asians are about adoption, so I didn't think those were quite right, though one of these is. But one that actually somebody privately chatted me and said she could see the word caste, see the book Caste, which I highly recommend, because it's talking about race in a different way. She chooses to describe how the US is a caste system. I really resonated with that, and I highly recommend. It's very readable. It's thick, but it's very readable. If you just search for books about, well, let me see. I try to read, I have a few books of theology by Asian writers. Children's books, of course, there are a lot. Somebody mentioned that. There are lots of good new books. There's some old ones that are not so good. Some of them have been canceled. So it's easy to find these. And I added a number of different sources on Instagram right after Atlanta. There's the Asian American Christian Collaboration, Asian Americans for Justice, and some others where I'm getting a daily diet of ideas and books and things like that. And I think surrounding yourself, as Lynn said, surrounding yourself with more voices. I also love seeing movies that are by and about Asians, and it's not because the movies are necessarily all the best movies. Like, I just love Crazy Rich Asians, not because it was a great story. Like, I have nothing in common with these people, but every single person in that movie was Asian. I'd never seen a movie like that, and so I watched it twice. So it's about representation. So read books, see movies, just hear voices from Asians.
Yeah, Wendy, I'm right there with you. I waited for Crazy Rich Asians with bated breath, not because I was necessarily interested in the storyline, but oh my gosh, to see all those Asians on the screen, Asian Americans, British Asians. Similarly, this past Christmas, I got all excited because there was, I think it was a Hallmark Christmas movie that was all Asians. It was like the cheesiest movie ever, but I had to watch it. Although I will admit, cheesy Christmas movies on Hallmark are probably one of my guilty pleasures anyway, but especially because it featured a cast of Asians. Yeah, I had to watch it. I have not read Caste yet by Isabel Wilkerson, but I would highly recommend her previous book, which is actually it's about the African-American Great Migration, but she is an amazing writer, has a gift for writing about nonfiction in a way that reads like fiction. It's very, like Wendy said, very readable. One of my favorite authors is Amy Tan. She comes from a Chinese American background, so not the same as my background, but she also is an excellent writer and has a plethora of books that she has published. I remember watching what was her book that became a movie? Oh, the name's escaping me now.
Was it The Joy Luck Club?
Yes, The Joy Luck Club. I remember watching that movie when I was in college, and even though it was about the Chinese American immigrant mother and American-born daughter's experience, it just, I resonate with a lot of it. I can go on and on. If you want a nonfiction kind of understanding of how white supremacy and white privilege and power have been kind of embedded into our society over generations, I really recommend Power, Privilege, and Difference, which is available on Amazon and through other booksellers. It's very good. As for the Vietnamese experience and authors, I just recently finished reading the book The Mountains Sing, which is by a Vietnamese author. Actually, she's known for her poetry, I believe. This was her first novel. And I listened to the audio version, which was very enriching for me because the narrator actually is also of Vietnamese descent. And there are parts of the book that use Vietnamese language, and so it was just beautiful to hear it spoken. But also I learned a lot about parts of Vietnam and parts of Vietnamese history that are not part of my family's story. The main character in the book lives in North Vietnam. It jumps between two different generations of story, so I learned more about what happened in Vietnam prior to the American war there. So that's one that is very top of mind for me because I recently finished reading it.
Those were all great recommendations. I won't sort of add to the mounting list, but for me, things that have stuck out recently, I am more of a fiction gal than a nonfiction gal. So I remember Bao, which was the Disney Pixar short, was really cute. The Farewell, which features Aquafina and is about a multi-generational Asian American family and how they deal with their grandmother's cancer diagnosis. Little Fires Everywhere is a great book. I think It made it into Oprah's book list too. Really loved that. And then Ocean Vuong, who is a Vietnamese American poet. I heard a feature on NPR's Fresh Air and was just absolutely captured by the poetry there, and ended up purchasing one of the books. So those are just some of the top of my recommendations.
I've actually just started reading Ocean Vuong's book, Once We Were Gorgeous. I think that's the title. It is powerful. It is also difficult because it is told from the immigrant perspective, and it's not a lighthearted read, but it is beautiful. Also, I have to say that Disney is about to, or has just released Raya and the Last Dragon, which is a fictional story, but it takes its influences from Southeast Asian culture, and it's the first Disney story to take its influence from Southeast Asian culture. So shout out to the Vietnamese.
Also, if you're willing to watch things with subtitles, anything out of Bollywood is absolutely fascinating. And if you can find a good K-drama, a Korean drama, they are incredible too. Emotional roller.
The book that I just finished is called Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong. And in that I learned, I think this is where I learned it, that there was a plastic surgeon who was served in Korea right after the war, and worked especially with cleft palate cases, but he also popularized the surgery that is very, very common in South Korea, to change your eyelids to looking Western. And I learned that he practiced this technique on prostitutes to make them more attractive to soldiers from America. So I'd known that South Korea is probably the #1 country in the world for plastic surgery. I did not know that story about the origin. And the book that I'm reading right now is called The Sum of Us. I'm not very far into it, but it's the subtitle is What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. I think the word "sum" refers to the idea that it's a zero-sum game, which is in caste also, that part of the technique that's used in a racialized society like ours is to tell people that there's not enough for everybody. And so those immigrants who are coming, or those people who don't look like you, are taking your stuff. And the reality is that's not true. That's not a limited pie. And so I like these books that help us understand how we can understand what's being done to us. We are not in competition. Asians have often been used to compete negatively with Black Americans. And so we've seen that kind of racial tension that can't be ignored, and there's fault to put in different places, but we're part of a system that encourages us to see other people as threats. So these are a few books that deal with that.
I will add that our district has a racial justice team, and we are putting together what we're calling a toolbox that's on the district website, and it includes some of the resources that you all have mentioned. And I would be thrilled if the three of you would send me your list, because we'll add that to our toolbox. Nancy, anything else that we can do yet? Or I know we're actually a few minutes over our time.
We are over our time, and thank you, Dave, for suggesting the kind of an annotated bibliography. I was thinking gathering all these ideas together would be just wonderful, and that maybe needs to be published on the Brethren website. But I did put in chat the address for where the recording will likely be posted on the Church of the Brethren website if you want to watch it again or pass that link on to others. It should be posted there soon. There are a lot of resources in the chat, and also some thanks to all of you starting to appear there. So this could go on for a long time. Obviously, the conversation is so rich, but we are so honored to have you with us and for you to share your stories. It's just been a great pleasure. I'm just really deeply grateful for each one of you. So thanks to all who have come. And I think we will bring this to a close, but I'm really thankful for each one of you. And so thank you for joining us. And thank you, Dave and Wendy and Madeline and Lynn, for being with us. So good evening, everyone. Good night.